The winter wind cut through the Montana plains like a sharpened knife, carrying with it a chill that gnawed at the bones of anyone daring enough to be outside. Snow crunched beneath the heavy boots of the men gathered at the edge of the dusty trail, and the horses stamped nervously, snorting steam into the freezing air. It was early morning, but the sun barely pierced the gray sky, casting the valley in a pale, ghostly light. From a distance, a small figure approached, hunched against the cold, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She moved carefully, step by step, as though every footfall carried the weight of the life she was about to leave behind. The news of her arrival had spread quickly across the neighboring homesteads. Whispers followed her like shadows. The girl was young, barely 19, and she had been sold as a bride. Her family had traded her to a rancher, a man known for his stern ways and iron will, and now she was to meet the man who would dictate the next chapter of her life. Some said she had a spirit unbroken by fear. Others murmured that she had none at all, and that she would simply bend to the life forced upon her. Neither side knew the truth, and both feared the answer. At the heart of the ranch, the house stood like a fortress. Its wooden walls, weathered gray by decades of wind and sun, seemed almost alive in the snow, groaning under the weight of frost and age. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, the only sign of warmth inside. The rancher, a man whose reputation carried as much weight as the rolling hills themselves, paced the main hall. He was broad-shouldered and tall, with hands calloused by years of labor, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed a mind always at work. His men had warned him that the girl would be timid, perhaps even frightened beyond measure. But the rancher's own reaction when first catching sight of her remained a secret, locked away behind a carefully controlled expression. When she finally reached the gate, her breath visible in the frigid air, the rancher stepped forward. His coat hung heavily over his frame, gusted with snow from the walk through the yard. He studied her closely, taking in the quiet strength in her posture, the determination in her steady gaze. She was nothing like he had imagined. Not fragile, not timid, but something else entirely, something that demanded acknowledgement. Those who watched from the barn and the surrounding fields held their breath, knowing that whatever he did next would set the tone for everything to come. The girl lowered her eyes for a moment, curtsying awkwardly as the rancher approached. He made no immediate move to greet her, no handshake, no word. His silence was deliberate, a test perhaps, or maybe a silent judgment. She felt a chill in her chest, one that had nothing to do with the cold Montana wind. She had been told stories of men like him, men who ruled their lands with iron fists, men whose decisions could make or break lives. But meeting him face to face was different. There was a presence about him that made the land itself seem smaller, and yet there was a weight of expectation, a tension that pressed down upon her, heavier than any coat or blanket could. The rancher finally spoke, his voice low, deliberate, carrying over the snow-crusted yard. "You've come a long way," he said. His eyes did not waver, and though his words were simple, there was a gravity to them that made her heart race. She nodded, uncertain, wondering if he understood more than he let on. If he knew that this was not a meeting of convenience, but a transaction with consequences far beyond money. She sensed the eyes of the ranch hands on her, some curious, some doubtful, all waiting to see how she would respond to the man who now held her fate in his hands. He motioned toward the house, and she followed, her steps careful, almost hesitant. Each footfall on the snow-covered path echoed like a drumbeat, a prelude to the life she was about to enter. Inside, the house was warmer, but the heat did little to ease the tension that seemed to fill every corner. The walls were lined with relics of the rancher's long life in the territory, rifles, saddles, hunting trophies, and photographs of men whose names she didn't know. She tried to focus on them, to distract herself from the growing unease, but it was impossible. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, reminded her that she was in a place where she would have to prove herself, whether she wanted to or not. The rancher finally stopped in the center of the room, his gaze never leaving hers. There was a moment of pause so still it seemed the world itself had stopped, that hung between them. The men outside whispered among themselves, but inside, time felt suspended. She had been prepared for a cold reception, perhaps even hostility, but not this. This quiet scrutiny, the kind that penetrated deeper than words ever could, was something entirely different. "You're different from what I expected," he said at last, his tone soft but firm. She lifted her head, her own eyes meeting his for the first time, and in that instant a spark of understanding passed between them. He saw more than her outward appearance, more than the transaction that had brought her here. He saw her resolve, her courage, and perhaps even a hint of defiance. The rancher's men exchanged uneasy glances. None had expected their master to react like this. Some had whispered that he would be indifferent, others that he would be harsh, but this, the quiet intensity of his gaze and the careful consideration in his words, was something entirely new. It unsettled them, and it unsettled her. She had been warned that life here would be hard, but she hadn't anticipated that the first battle would be fought not with tools or livestock, but with something far subtler, attention and judgment. As she stood there, unsure of what to say, the rancher finally turned away, walking toward the large fireplace where a pot of stew simmered quietly. The aroma filled the room, but it did little to calm her nerves. She knew that whatever reaction came next would shape the days, weeks, and perhaps years to come. And then, just as she began to gather her courage, he glanced back over his shoulder, a shadow of a smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Tomorrow," he said, almost as an afterthought, "you'll begin your work. But tonight, you'll eat and you'll rest. There's much to learn and even more to prove." His words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind that made her stomach tighten and her heart race. She nodded again, unsure if she had done the right thing by coming, unsure if she had the strength for what lay ahead. Outside, the wind howled against the walls of the house, and the rancher's men returned to their chores, whispering to one another about the unusual meeting. The girl sat quietly at the table, her hands folded in her lap, thinking of the journey that had brought her here. She had crossed towns, rivers, and plains, all for a life that was promised but not guaranteed. And now, standing on the threshold of her new world, she wondered what the man she had been sold to would truly want from her, and what she might have to give in return. The night stretched long and heavy over the ranch. Outside, the snow lay thick and unbroken, and the wind's eerie song carried across the valley. Inside, the house was warm, but tension lingered like smoke from a fire that refused to die. The girl stared into the flickering flames, thinking of her family, her home, and the life she had left behind. Somewhere in the shadows, the rancher watched, calculating, observing, and waiting. Neither of them spoke, yet the air between them was alive with possibilities, a silent challenge that neither could ignore. And so the first night passed, a quiet battle of glances and unspoken words, leaving both wondering who would bend first and who would shape the future of this unexpected union. Outside, the wind continued its endless howl, carrying promises of trials yet to come. Tomorrow, the ranch would awaken, and with it, a story would begin, one that would test courage, strength, and the unexpected depths of human connection. But tonight, all that remained was the fragile, uneasy silence and the question that hung in the air like frost. How would the rancher truly react to the girl who had been sold as a virgin bride? The morning arrived slow and gray, the kind of dawn that felt like it had been waiting, watching, before it fully appeared. The girl woke to the faint smell of wood smoke and the low murmur of men working somewhere beyond the walls of the house. She lay in the small bed provided for her, tucked beneath thick blankets, but sleep had not been kind. Dreams of her family, the journey, and the unknown rancher mingled with a restless fear that seemed to press against her chest like the winter wind outside. Slowly, she rose, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and stepped toward the window. The ranch stretched wide, a patchwork of frozen pastures and snow-covered hills, dotted with livestock that huddled against the cold. The barns were alive with activity, the clatter of tools and shouts of ranch hands echoing across the plain. She watched silently, noting the way the men moved, each step purposeful, each task carried out with an efficiency born of years under the rancher's rule. She wondered where she would fit into this world, what place she could claim in a life that had been decided for her before she had even arrived. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. The rancher stepped inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, snow still clinging to the hem of his coat. He carried himself with the same quiet authority she had noticed the night before, the kind of presence that made the house seem smaller and the air heavier. He did not smile, but his eyes, sharp, calculating, held a glint of curiosity that unsettled her more than fear ever could. "Breakfast is ready," he said, his voice low and steady. "Eat well. You'll need your strength." There was no invitation in his words, only instruction, but somehow it felt more like a challenge than a command. She followed him to the table, where a simple meal of bread, salted meat, and coffee awaited. The smell made her stomach tighten, hunger mingling with nerves. She sat quietly, careful not to meet his gaze too directly, yet unable to resist stealing glances at the man whose judgment now seemed to shadow every move she made. The rancher sat across from her, silent at first, watching as she ate. It was clear he was assessing her, noting the way she handled the food, the careful movements of her hands, the quiet strength in her posture. She felt exposed under his scrutiny, but she refused to look away. She had been taught that fear and uncertainty were weapons others could use against you, and she was determined not to give them an advantage. Once breakfast was finished, the rancher spoke again, his tone softer but still firm. "You'll begin with chores in the barn today. Learn the animals, their habits, and your place here. The work is hard, but it is honest. Understand that, and you will earn respect." His words were simple, but layered, hinting at a world of rules she had yet to learn. She nodded, unsure how to respond, but sensing that any hesitation would be noted and remembered. As she followed him out into the biting wind, the reality of the ranch hit her fully. The barns were massive, filled with horses, cattle, and equipment that seemed far beyond anything she had known. Men moved efficiently, shouting brief instructions to one another, their faces hardened by years of labor and cold. The rancher's voice carried over the noise, commanding attention without effort. He introduced her briefly, but only with a nod, and she sensed that the men's opinions of her would be formed quickly, silently, by observation rather than conversation. She was handed a broom first, tasked with sweeping the floor of one of the stalls. It was hard, tiring work, and the cold seeped into her bones despite her layers. She bent over the task, keeping her focus on the movements, counting each sweep to distract herself from the weight of the day ahead. The rancher watched from the doorway, silent, observing her endurance, her resolve, the way she handled discomfort without complaint. She felt the eyes on her, and it both frightened and emboldened her. She realized quickly that this man's approval would not come easily, and that every small action might be measured, weighed, and judged. During a brief break, she allowed herself a moment to study the rancher more closely. There was something about him that seemed beyond simple authority. Perhaps it was the quiet way he moved, the subtle control of every situation, or the unspoken code of his life that she could almost sense but not name. There was a history there, she could tell, layers of experience and hardship that had shaped him into the man standing before her. She wondered what stories were hidden behind his stoic face, what past losses or triumphs had led him to this moment, and whether she would ever truly understand him. The hours passed slowly, each task revealing more about the land, the animals, and the people who worked it. She learned to read the horses' moods, to handle the stubborn cattle, and to follow instructions with careful precision. The rancher rarely spoke, letting her actions tell him what he needed to know. And though she was exhausted, she felt a strange sense of purpose, a recognition that the work, as grueling as it was, grounded her in this new world. By mid-afternoon, the wind had picked up again, driving icy snow across the fields. The rancher called a halt to work, gathering the men and the girl inside the main house. He moved through the room deliberately, explaining the rules of the ranch, the expectations for behavior, and the harsh realities of life on the frontier. There was no sugarcoating, no unnecessary kindness, only the blunt truth of survival in a land as unforgiving as it was beautiful. She listened closely, committing every word to memory, knowing that understanding these rules would be crucial to earning her place here. As the evening fell, the house seemed smaller, the shadows longer. The girl found herself near the fireplace again, watching the flames flicker and listening to the wind howl outside. She felt the weight of the rancher's gaze even when he was across the room, and it made her heart beat faster. There was something unspoken between them, a tension that neither could name but both could feel. It was as though the land itself, the snow outside, and the life within these walls held its breath, waiting to see how this strange new chapter would unfold. She thought of her family, of the journey that had brought her here, and of the uncertainty that lay ahead. The rancher, too, seemed lost in thought at times, staring into the fire with a look that suggested he carried burdens she could not yet understand. There was a mystery to him, a depth she could sense but not yet reach, and it both terrified and fascinated her. Night fell fully, and the house grew quiet. The girl prepared for bed, but sleep remained elusive. She could hear the distant calls of coyotes, the shifting of snow on the roof, and the faint creak of the rancher moving through the halls. Her mind wandered to the tasks of the next day, the lessons she had yet to learn, and the challenges that would test not only her strength but her spirit. Somewhere in the shadows, she knew, the rancher watched, studying her stillness, her resilience, and the way she carried herself under pressure. Outside, the wind howled as if carrying secrets from the mountains themselves, and the snow-covered plains lay waiting, full of possibility and danger alike. Inside, the tension between them remained unresolved, a quiet current running beneath the surface of ordinary tasks and routine chores. She wondered what tomorrow would bring, what tests the rancher might devise, and whether she would ever truly belong in this world she had been sold into. And so, the night stretched long, heavy with anticipation and silent questions. The rancher's reaction yesterday, the unspoken judgments, the subtle glances, all of it lingered, shaping the air between them like frost clinging to the windows. The girl lay awake, heart racing, knowing that the story of her life on this ranch had only just begun. And as the first stars appeared over the Montana plains, glittering cold and distant, she understood that everything ahead would demand courage, patience, and a strength she had yet to fully discover. The fire crackled, the wind screamed, and somewhere in the darkness, a new chapter waited, one filled with challenge, mystery, and the silent question of how the rancher would truly respond to the girl who had been sold as a bride. The next morning arrived colder than the one before, the wind sharper, carrying the kind of chill that made even seasoned ranch hands pull their coats tighter. The girl stepped out into the yard, the snow crunching under her boots, and took a steadying breath. Today she was to learn the cattle routes, a task that required both strength and careful judgment. She had watched the men at work, seen the way they handled the animals with a mixture of patience and authority, and now it was her turn to step into that world. The rancher waited near the edge of the field, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, his expression unreadable. He nodded at her as she approached, the faintest flicker of approval crossing his features before he returned to his usual stoicism. There was a weight to every movement he made, a deliberate control that seemed to pull the land and the men into line around him. She had not yet earned his trust, she realized, and every action she took would be measured against his silent expectations. The first task was simple in theory, but unforgiving in practice. She was to lead a small herd of cattle from one pasture to another, following a winding path across uneven ground. The animals were restless, their breath steaming in the freezing air, and she could feel the eyes of the rancher and the men on her as she took her first steps. One misstep, one moment of hesitation, and the consequences could be immediate. Her hands gripped the reins tightly, her knuckles white as she guided the herd forward, trying to keep them in line and moving steadily. One of the older ranch hands rode alongside her, offering advice and corrections in low, clipped tones. He was patient but firm, a man whose experience showed in every movement and every word. She listened closely, absorbing the instructions while keeping her focus on the herd. The rancher remained at a distance, observing, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Every time an animal strayed, she corrected it quickly, sensing that each small victory would earn her a little more acknowledgement, a little more room to prove herself. Hours passed with the rhythm of work, and slowly, she began to feel a sense of belonging in the task, even as exhaustion gnawed at her muscles. The wind howled across the plains, and the snow fell heavier now, dusting her coat and mingling with the sweat that clung to her skin. She glanced up at the rancher, whose expression had not softened, yet something in the way he watched suggested a growing recognition of her effort. Still, the tension lingered, unspoken but ever present, as though the land itself demanded she earn her place, and the man who had bought her had the power to decide whether she would. Back at the ranch house, the men spoke in hushed tones about the girl's performance, some impressed, others skeptical. Subplots emerged in the form of quiet rivalries and alliances among the ranch hands. One young man, ambitious and eager to prove himself, watched her with a mix of curiosity and resentment. He had been with the ranch for years, and the sudden attention she drew unsettled him. Another, older and more cautious, seemed to admire her determination, though he spoke little, observing silently as she navigated the challenges thrown her way. Each perspective added layers to the tension, and she was only beginning to understand that her presence would shift more than just her own life. The rancher's perspective remained the most mysterious. He seemed both intrigued and wary, the kind of man who measured every word, every glance, every motion before revealing even a fraction of his thoughts. Sometimes he lingered in the doorway, watching her, and she caught fleeting glimpses of something more complex behind his steely exterior, perhaps respect, perhaps calculation, or perhaps a memory of someone who had once tested him in ways she could not yet imagine. She realized that understanding him would be as difficult as mastering the land itself. By afternoon, the girl was exhausted but determined. The wind had not relented, and the cattle had grown restless again, testing her patience and skills. She had learned to anticipate their movements, to read their shifts in weight and behavior, and to respond before disaster struck. The older ranch hand riding beside her offered a rare nod of approval, and she allowed herself a small sense of pride, though it was quickly tempered by the knowledge that the true judgment would come from the rancher. Later, when the work was done, the rancher called her aside. He did not speak at first, simply watching her as she brushed snow from her coat and wiped her hands on her sleeves. Then he said, "You're stronger than I expected, and smarter too. That counts for something here." His words were measured, almost reluctant, yet they carried weight. She felt a flicker of something she had not expected, acknowledgement, perhaps, or the barest hint of trust. But it was fragile, and she knew it could vanish in an instant if she misstepped. Even as she felt a small victory, the tension returned in another form. A distant sound carried across the snow horses approaching from the far end of the property. The rancher's expression shifted subtly, and the men around her stiffened. She sensed that this was no ordinary arrival, and her heart quickened. The wind carried the sound, and she strained to see through the swirling snow, trying to discern friend from potential threat. The rancher's hand went to the rail of his gun, his stance alert but controlled. Whatever was coming, it demanded attention, and the girl felt the weight of the unknown pressing down again. As the horses drew nearer, she noticed the figure of a man on the lead horse, his features partially hidden by a wide-brimmed hat and a scarf wrapped around his face. The rancher's gaze sharpened, and he spoke to one of the older men quietly, issuing orders that carried an urgency she had not heard before. She could sense the undercurrent of tension among the men, the kind that spoke of past conflicts, unspoken grudges, or perhaps a threat to the delicate order the rancher maintained. The girl's mind raced. She had come here to learn to survive, to prove herself, but she was beginning to understand that survival required more than strength and determination. It required understanding the land, the men, and the unspoken rules that governed every interaction. She realized that the rancher's reaction, the quiet control he wielded, was both a shield and a weapon, and that her own place here depended on how well she could read these subtle currents of tension. The man on horseback came closer, and the girl could see now that his eyes were sharp, wary, and assessing. He dismounted with the ease of someone accustomed to the land, and the rancher stepped forward to meet him. Their conversation was low, measured, and filled with words she could not fully hear, but the weight in their tones spoke volumes. There was history here, hidden layers of conflict that extended beyond her own presence. She felt herself caught between the calm authority of the rancher and the wary vigilance of the newcomer, a silent triangle of uncertainty and potential danger. The rancher returned to her side after the man had gone, his expression as unreadable as ever. He said nothing about what had passed, but the tension lingered in the air. She understood that she had witnessed only a glimpse of the challenges she would face on this ranch, and that each day would bring new tests, new mysteries, and new lessons. The land itself seemed to hum with expectation, and she felt a mixture of fear and determination settle into her bones. As the sun dipped behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the snow, the girl prepared for another night by the fire. The wind continued its relentless howl, and the house, once a sanctuary from the cold, now felt alive with unspoken stories and hidden challenges. She thought of the rancher, his quiet authority, and the mysterious stranger who had ridden across her path. Every detail hinted at struggles she had yet to face, alliances she might need to forge, and dangers she could not yet anticipate. She could feel the land, the people, and the unspoken tensions all converging, creating a web of complexity she had not imagined. And yet, despite the fear, there was a spark of resolve. She had come this far, survived the journey, and begun to prove her strength. But she knew that true survival would require more than work and determination. It would require understanding the motives and secrets of those around her, especially the rancher whose reaction could shape every outcome. The fire crackled in the hearth, shadows dancing along the walls, and she felt the presence of the man who had brought her here, the weight of his gaze even from across the room. Outside, the wind whispered over the plains, carrying with it the promise of trials yet to come. She settled into the blankets, exhausted but alert, knowing that tomorrow would test her in ways she could not yet predict. And as the stars began to pierce the dark Montana sky, she understood that her life on the ranch had only just begun. The challenges, the conflicts, and the mysteries were only growing stronger. The rancher's reaction, the arrival of the stranger, and the quiet judgments of the men around her would continue to shape her every move. Her story was far from resolved, and the tension that hung in the air promised that each new day would bring both danger and discovery. The night stretched on, heavy with the weight of unspoken questions and fragile alliances. She lay awake, listening to the wind, the shifting of snow, and the faint sound of movement in the house. Somewhere in the shadows, the rancher watched, always calculating, always present, and the girl knew that her journey into this new, harsh world was only beginning. The next morning brought a heavy, restless wind, whipping across the frozen plains like a warning. The girl rose before the sun, her muscles sore from the day before, but a fierce determination kept her moving. Today would be different, she told herself. She could feel it in the air, the tension was higher, thicker, as though the land itself waited for something to happen. Every step toward the barn was measured, every breath visible in the cold, each movement a preparation for the trials she knew were coming. The rancher was already outside, inspecting the horses with the same calm authority that had both intimidated and fascinated her since her arrival. His eyes flicked toward her as she approached, and for a brief moment there was a shift in acknowledgement that she was no longer merely a newcomer, but a participant in the life of the ranch. She felt a mixture of pride and unease, knowing that this small recognition carried weight far beyond what she could yet understand. "You'll handle the north herd today," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "They're stubborn, skittish, and prone to wandering. Watch the lead steer closely and don't lose focus." "The land is open, but mistakes can be costly," she nodded, gripping the reins of the lead horse, her hands steady despite the cold. The herd was large, more than she had dealt with before, and the ground uneven and icy. Her heart raced with anticipation and fear, a combination that made her senses sharper and her awareness keener. The other ranch hands spread out around her, some offering quiet guidance, others observing silently, their expressions unreadable. One young man, who had been wary of her since her first day, rode beside her with a critical eye, testing her resolve at every turn. His subtle challenges, slightly misdirected hints, a tug on a stubborn steer pushed her to make decisions quickly and trust her instincts. She felt the tension in the group building, a pressure that went beyond the work itself, a silent contest of endurance and judgment. As the herd moved across the snow-dusted fields, the wind intensified, carrying flakes that stung the skin and blurred vision. The lead steer, a massive, defiant animal, broke formation, heading toward a section of the fence that had been weakened by ice. The girl's heart jumped. If the animal broke free, it could trigger chaos across the herd. She spurred her horse forward, voice firm and steady, guiding the animal back in line. Her hands burned from the reins, her arms ached, but the focus never wavered. The rancher watched from a distance, his gaze fixed on her every move, silent but exacting in its scrutiny. Hours passed with relentless effort. She corrected the herd, soothed skittish animals, and navigated treacherous terrain. Every success was immediately followed by another challenge, a sudden gust of wind, a slipping horse, a steer that tested her patience. She could feel the rancher's judgment like a shadow at her side, sometimes approving, sometimes calculating, always present. She understood, more than ever, that her survival here was not just about strength, but perception, intelligence, and the ability to remain calm under relentless pressure. By late afternoon, the north herd was finally in its new enclosure, safe and accounted for. The girl's body was exhausted, but her mind was alive with the adrenaline of accomplishment and the awareness that the day had revealed more than her skill. It had shown her resilience, her ability to act decisively, and, perhaps most importantly, her capacity to earn respect. Yet the rancher offered nothing more than a brief nod as she dismounted. She knew this small gesture carried immense significance. It was acknowledgment without praise, judgment without words, and it both unsettled and motivated her. Back at the ranch house, the men gathered around the fire, some exhausted, some thoughtful. The young man who had ridden beside her gave a curt nod, a silent admission that she had earned her place in their eyes, if not yet in his own. The older hands remained quiet, their expressions unreadable, but she could sense approval in the way they observed her from a distance. The rancher moved through the room, placing tools and checking equipment, his presence both commanding and subtly watchful. She understood that the day's challenges were only a fraction of what awaited her, and that the real tests were still ahead. That evening, as the sky darkened and stars began to pierce the cold Montana night, a new tension arose. A rider appeared on the horizon, galloping swiftly across the snow, a figure wrapped tightly against the cold. The rancher's eyes narrowed, and he exchanged a few quiet words with one of the older men. The girl felt the air thicken, the anticipation almost tangible, as though the land itself waited to see how this unexpected visitor would shift the delicate balance of power on the ranch. The rider dismounted near the gate, revealing a man whose presence carried authority and experience. His eyes scanned the ranch with careful precision, lingering briefly on the girl. There was a subtle recognition there, a silent measurement of capability and potential. The rancher approached him with cautious yet controlled authority, and they exchanged words she could not fully hear. The weight in their conversation was clear, a mix of strategy, warnings, and past histories that hinted at conflicts unresolved. The girl watched closely, understanding instinctively that whatever had passed between them would ripple through the ranch in the days to come. As the visitor departed, the tension lingered like frost on the windows. The rancher remained silent for some time, moving through his duties with a deliberate calm. She realized that beneath his stoicism there was always calculation, always assessment, and that every action she took would be scrutinized against this backdrop of experience and authority. Her mind raced with questions. Who had the rider been? What did he want? And how would this change her place on the ranch? The following days tested her in ways she had not imagined. The rancher introduced new challenges, some subtle, some glaring, each designed to test not only her skill but her judgment, patience, and resilience. She learned to anticipate problems before they arose, to make decisions that balanced caution with boldness. The young man who had once been skeptical now observed her with a mix of respect and unresolved competition, while the older hands offered guidance that was more measured, more nuanced. Every interaction, every small success, and every failure carried weight. One afternoon, a sudden blizzard swept across the plains, the wind whipping snow into blinding sheets. The girl found herself leading a small herd back to shelter, the terrain slippery and the animals panicked. Her hands burned, her muscles ached, and her nerves strained to keep pace with the chaos around her. The rancher rode nearby, silent, his eyes watching, judging, guiding only with subtle gestures. She realized that this was the culmination of everything she had learned, the tests, the observations, the lessons from each hand, each moment of challenge. The storm amplified the tension, leaving little room for error, and she felt a thrill of fear and determination course through her. At the edge of the field, a fence had been weakened by the ice, threatening to let the herd escape. She acted quickly, using all she had learned, her voice steady as she guided the animals into safety. A slip, a hesitation, could have undone everything, and she felt the weight of the rancher's watchful eyes on her back. When the last animal was secured, she looked up at him, expecting judgment, correction, perhaps disappointment. Instead, there was a brief nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her chest tighten with relief and anticipation. That night, the fire burned brighter than usual in the main house, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The rancher moved among the men, offering brief words of acknowledgment and instruction, his attention occasionally drifting to her. She sensed a shift, subtle but undeniable, in the way he regarded her. She had proven herself in the work, in the storms, in the quiet moments of observation and endurance. And yet the tension remained, as if the land itself, the men, and the rancher were still holding their breath, waiting for the next challenge, the next test. She could feel the suspense building, the anticipation of what lay ahead, a sense that the story of her life on the ranch was reaching a critical point. There were questions unanswered, rivalries unresolved, and mysteries surrounding the rancher's past that hinted at future conflict. Each day brought her closer to understanding, yet each revelation only raised new uncertainties. The balance between respect, trust, and fear was delicate, and she understood that one misstep could shift everything. As the wind howled outside and the snow drifted against the windows, she realized that the climax of her journey was approaching. The lessons she had learned, the strength she had built, and the subtle bonds forming with those around her would all be tested in the days to come. The rancher's reaction, the rivalries among the men, and the quiet uncertainties of the land created a tension that could not yet be resolved. She lay awake, staring at the flickering flames, heart racing, knowing that the next challenge would push her to the edge of fear and determination. The plains outside were vast and silent under the moonlight, but the air inside the house was thick with anticipation. Every glance, every movement, every unspoken word contributed to the growing suspense. She had arrived as a newcomer, uncertain and cautious, and now she stood on the edge of proving herself, of earning trust, and of facing challenges that would define her life on the ranch. The climax was near, and she could feel it in every ache of her body, every nervous glance, and every flicker of the rancher's watchful eyes. And so the story paused on the precipice of change. The girl, tested and determined, awaited the moments that would define her courage, the rancher's reaction, and the unfolding of alliances, rivalries, and secrets that had long shaped the land. The tension was at its peak, the suspense unrelenting, and the promise of resolution still just out of reach, leaving the plains, the house, and the hearts within them heavy with anticipation. The morning sun broke over the Montana plains in a soft glow that lit the snow like gold. The girl stepped outside, her breath forming clouds in the crisp air, and felt the quiet strength of the land beneath her boots. The events of the past days weighed heavily on her, but today carried a different energy. She had learned the rhythm of the ranch, understood the demands of the work, and begun to earn the quiet respect of the men around her. The tension she had felt since her arrival still lingered, but it no longer held her in fear. Instead, it drove her forward, sharpening her focus and giving her a sense of purpose she had not known before. The rancher emerged from the house, his coat dusted with snow, and met her gaze with the same steady authority she had come to recognize. There was no harshness in his expression today, only a quiet acknowledgement. "The North herd is ready to move," he said simply. "Lead them." His words were straightforward, but there was a subtle confidence in his tone, a trust that he rarely extended. She nodded, a small thrill of accomplishment warming her despite the cold. Today, she was not just a newcomer learning her place, she was a part of the life of the ranch, a contributor whose actions mattered. As she guided the herd across the frozen fields, she noticed the men watching more closely, their expressions softened by admiration and respect. Even the young man who had challenged her from the beginning now offered brief nods and subtle gestures of approval. She understood that her courage, persistence, and willingness to take responsibility had shifted the dynamics of the ranch. She felt a growing sense of belonging, and with it, a quiet pride that strengthened her resolve. The rancher rode beside her for part of the journey, occasionally giving instructions, his voice calm but precise. She noticed something new in his expression, an unspoken recognition of her determination and skill. He did not praise her, not in words, but the subtle changes in his demeanor spoke volumes. The way he adjusted his pace to match hers, the way he watched her handle the herd, and the brief nod he gave when she corrected a stubborn steer, all of it conveyed a sense of trust that had been absent in the early days. She felt the bond between them deepening, built on respect earned through action and endurance. By mid-afternoon, the herd had reached its destination safely, and the girl dismounted, exhausted but satisfied. The rancher observed her quietly, his gaze steady and approving. "You've done well," he said finally, his voice carrying more warmth than she had heard before. She allowed herself a small smile, feeling a mixture of relief and pride. The words were simple, but their significance was profound. She had faced challenges, uncertainty, and judgment, and she had emerged stronger, capable, and more confident than she had ever imagined. The men gathered around the barn, sharing stories and laughter, a rare lightness in the air after days of tension. The young man who had doubted her approached, offering a genuine nod of respect. "You handled that better than anyone could expect," he admitted, his tone reluctant but sincere. The girl smiled, appreciating the acknowledgement. She realized that the rivalries and judgments that had seemed insurmountable were now easing, replaced by camaraderie and quiet admiration. Inside the house, the rancher moved through his routines with a sense of satisfaction that had been absent in previous days. He checked the stables, reviewed the day's work, and made notes for the coming days. Occasionally, his gaze drifted to the girl, a subtle acknowledgement of her growth and contribution. She felt the tension between them shift, replaced by a steady understanding that went beyond words. The foundation of trust and respect was building, solid and unwavering. That evening, the girl sat by the fire, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought of the long trip, the uncertainty, and the moments of fear and doubt. She also thought of the lessons learned, the skills acquired, and the quiet victories that had marked each day. The challenges had been daunting, yet they had revealed her own strength, resilience, and capacity for courage. She realized that she had not only survived this new life, she had begun to thrive within it. The rancher joined her by the fire, bringing a quiet presence that felt less intimidating now, more companionable. He offered her a small smile, one that carried an unspoken acknowledgement of the journey they had shared and the challenges overcome. "You've learned much in a short time," he said. "And there's more to come, but I trust you will meet it as you have the rest." His words, steady and sincere, marked the final shift in the unspoken tension that had defined their early days together. She felt a sense of relief, yes, but also a quiet pride in knowing that she had earned his trust and respect. The following days passed with a rhythm that balanced work, learning, and quiet reflection. The girl continued to develop her skills, navigating the challenges of the ranch with growing confidence. The men around her offered guidance, encouragement, and subtle tests that strengthened her understanding of the land and its demands. The young man who had once been her rival now worked alongside her, the tension between them transformed into mutual respect. The older ranch hands offered advice and support, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations, and she absorbed it with determination and gratitude. Through it all, the rancher's presence remained a steady, guiding force. His judgment, once silent and exacting, now carried hints of pride and acknowledgement. He observed her closely, offering instruction, encouragement, and occasionally allowing her independence to demonstrate her growing capabilities. The bond between them deepened, rooted in mutual respect, understanding, and a recognition of each other's strengths. One afternoon, a minor crisis tested everything she had learned. A sudden storm caused a section of fencing to collapse, and a few cattle escaped into the rough terrain. The girl acted immediately, rallying the herd and directing the men with clear, confident instructions. The rancher rode beside her, offering guidance only when necessary, allowing her to take the lead. The situation was tense, the stakes high, but her composure and decisiveness prevented disaster. By the time the storm passed, all the cattle were safe, and the rancher's brief nod conveyed more approval than any words could express. As the days turned to weeks, the girl's place on the ranch became secure. The men respected her, the land responded to her hands, and the rancher's acknowledgement, once subtle and restrained, now carried a quiet warmth. The initial tension, the fear and uncertainty that had defined her early days, was replaced by a sense of belonging, accomplishment, and mutual respect. She had proven herself, not through words or pleas, but through action, determination, and courage. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose, the rancher and the girl stood side by side, watching the herd settle into the pasture. The wind had softened, the air was calm, and the day's work was done. "You've grown stronger than I expected," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers with a depth of respect and understanding. She felt a warmth in her chest, a recognition of the journey they had shared, the trials overcome, and the bond that had developed between them. She smiled softly, a mixture of pride and relief washing over her. "I've had good teachers," she replied, her voice steady, carrying sincerity and gratitude. He inclined his head, a subtle acknowledgment of her words and the partnership they had forged through hard work, challenge, and shared effort. The house behind them seemed warmer, the ranch alive with a sense of quiet accomplishment, and the plains stretched out, vast and peaceful, carrying the promise of a future built on respect, trust, and determination. As night fell, the girl returned to her small room, her heart lighter, her mind calmer. She reflected on the journey that had begun with fear and uncertainty, on the challenges that had tested her strength, and on the relationships that had formed along the way. She realized that the rancher's reactions, once a source of tension and mystery, had guided her growth and shaped her confidence. The trials, the rivalries, and the uncertainties had all contributed to her understanding of this land and the people who worked it. Outside, the plains lay quiet under a blanket of snow, the stars bright and clear in the night sky. The wind was calm, carrying only the soft whispers of the land. Inside, the house was filled with the quiet rhythm of life on the ranch, the subtle warmth of camaraderie, and the unspoken acknowledgment of accomplishments achieved and challenges met. The girl felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that she had earned her place, gained respect, and begun to build a life defined by courage, resilience, and trust. In the weeks that followed, life on the ranch settled into a steady rhythm, each day offering new opportunities for growth, learning, and connection. The girl became an integral part of the ranch, her contributions valued, her courage recognized, and her relationships strengthened. The rancher, once distant and exacting, now shared a quiet partnership with her, their bond rooted in mutual respect and understanding. The men, once skeptical, had come to trust her judgment and abilities, and the young rival now worked alongside her in shared purpose and acknowledgement. And so the story reached its natural conclusion, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with quiet victories, earned trust, and the satisfaction of challenges overcome. The girl had arrived uncertain and fearful, sold into a world unknown, yet she had grown strong, capable, and respected. The rancher's reactions, once a source of tension and anticipation, had guided her journey, revealing both challenges and opportunities. The plains stretched endlessly before them, filled with promise, work, and the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed through courage and determination. The Montana wind continued its gentle whispers, carrying the stories of resilience, respect, and strength across the snow-covered land. The girl, now secure in her place, looked toward the future with a sense of hope and belonging. She had faced trials, navigated uncertainties, and discovered the power within herself to endure and thrive. The rancher, once a figure of mystery and authority, had become a partner in shared purpose, their bond built on trust, observation, and mutual respect. In the quiet of the night, as the fire burned low and the ranch lay peaceful, the girl understood the lessons of her journey. Courage, determination, and patience had guided her through the most difficult days. Respect, trust, and understanding had shaped the relationships that defined her new life. And through it all, the vast Montana plains had witnessed a transformation, not only of a young girl sold into a world unknown, but of a life shaped by challenge, resilience, and the quiet promise of happiness.